On a cold Tuesday in March, in a two-room apartment above a laundromat in Hendricks Hollow, Kentucky, Nadine Hollis sat at her kitchen table and counted everything she had left in the world. 200. In $11.47 she counted it twice, not because she was afraid of getting it wrong, but because her hands needed something to hold while her mind refused to accept the number. The apartment smelled of cold coffee and motor oil, a smell she'd carried on her clothes for 31 years of marriage, to a man who had died 4 days before, in the back room of a repair shop she hadn't set foot in for longer than she could remember. Warren Hollis had been a fix-it man. That was what people in Hendricks Hollow called him. Not a mechanic, not a technician, a fix-it man. He fixed toasters and lawnmowers, furnace blowers and rocking chairs, the things people in small towns couldn't afford to replace and couldn't bear to throw away. For 31 years Nadine had called that a kindness they couldn't afford. She was a bookkeeper by trade. She understood ledgers and columns and the particular arithmetic of surviving on not enough. She knew exactly what Warren's repairs were worth because she was the one who priced them, or tried to. She'd typed the rate sheet herself and taped it to the counter. Small appliance, $15. Furniture, by the hour. And every week without fail, Warren came home with less than the sheet said he should, because Mrs. Pruitt's furnace had died, and she was on a fixed income, or because a boy from the trailer park had carried in a bicycle, and his mother was working double shifts at the plant. Nadine had been angry about it for 31 years. She opened the envelope the county attorney had handed her the day before the funeral. The will was a single page. Warren Hollis left his wife everything, the apartment, $2,000 in a checking account that had not grown since 2019, and the repair shop at 14 Cinder Street, appraised at a value of $0. The county assessor had added a note, almost kindly. The building had failed its last 2 structural inspections. If she wanted, the county could take the property back for unpaid taxes and handle the demolition at no cost to her. Nadine set the paper down. She looked at the $211.47 in front of her. She thought about the heating bill due on the 15th. She thought about the fact that she was 52 years old, that her eyes had started going weak, that she had spent 31 years keeping books for other people's businesses, and had somehow arrived at this kitchen table with nothing but a repair shop the county wanted to knock down. She told herself she'd go down to clear it out, take whatever tools could be sold, sign the county's paperwork and walk away clean. That is what she told herself, but she had not slept in 4 days, and grief does strange things to a person's logic. The shop at 14 Cinder Street was a single-story cinder block building at the edge of town, squeezed between a closed hardware store and an empty lot. The sign above the door had been hand-painted decades ago. Hollis Repair, faded to the point where you had to already know what it said to read it. Nadine unlocked the front door for the first time in 3 years. The smell hit her first, machine oil and sawdust and old rubber, with something underneath that she could only identify as Warren. Not his cologne, because he'd never worn any. The smell of his hands after a day's work. She stood in the doorway longer than she meant to. Inside, the shop was cluttered but not careless. Tools hung on pegboard in an order only Warren understood. The long workbench ran the length of the back wall, scarred with burns and cuts that were the history of 30 years. 3 machines waited on the bench in various states of disassembly. A box fan with a cracked housing, a chest freezer without a cord, a child's bicycle with a bent frame, painted over twice. None of them would ever be finished now. And then she noticed the boy. He was sitting on a 3-legged stool in the corner, still in his coat, watching her with the patient alertness of someone who had been waiting a long time and had learned not to show it. He looked about 16, thin, with dark eyes, and the particular stillness of a person who has decided the world is easier to observe than to participate in. He did not speak when she looked at him. He did not look away either. She asked who he was. The boy looked at her steadily. Then he raised one hand and touched the workbench, gently, the way you'd touch something to make sure it was still real. She found out from the woman at the diner, 2 blocks over, that his name was Kit. That he'd been coming to the shop every day after school for 3 years, that he didn't speak. Not because he couldn't understand things, but because his brain worked differently, and the world of words had never quite made room for him. Warren had been the only person in Hendricks Hollow who didn't seem to mind. He'd given Kit the stool in the corner, and a set of old screwdrivers, and they'd worked side by side through 3 winters without exchanging more than a handful of words. Warren taught with his hands. Kit learned the same way. Nadine stood in the shop and let that settle over her. She started cleaning because she didn't know what else to do. She stacked boxes. She swept the floor that Warren had swept every evening for 30 years. She found, underneath a tarp in the back room, a second workbench. Smaller, lower, built at a height that matched Kit exactly. Warren had built it at some point without saying a word to anyone. She stood there looking at it for a long time. She found a strip of masking tape on the edge of the main workbench, old and yellowed at the corners. 4 words in Warren's marker. "Worth keeping is worth fixing." She peeled it off carefully and held it until the edges curled against her palm. That was when she noticed the filing cabinet. It stood in the back room corner, 2-drawer gray steel, the kind from an office that hadn't been updated since 1987. The top drawer held tax records and insurance forms. The bottom drawer had a small padlock through the latch. She had no idea where the key was. She might have left it, she almost did, but Kit was still on his stool, watching her with those steady eyes, and something about the weight of his patience made her feel like she owed a debt she didn't fully understand yet. She found a hammer in the tool rack. 3 strikes and the latch came free. Before we tell you what Nadine found in that filing cabinet, and we promise you, it is the thing that changes everything, we want to take one moment and ask something of you. If this story is reaching you, if you believe that a quiet life of honest work deserves to be told, please subscribe to Giant Stories right now and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. A single comment helps this story find the person who needs to hear it. Now let's go back to Nadine, standing in that back room with a broken padlock in her hand. The bottom drawer held composition notebooks, the kind sold 3 for $1, black and white marbled covers, college-ruled pages. There were more than 40 of them, stacked tight, the earliest ones swollen with age. She pulled the first one out. On the inside cover in Warren's careful block print was a heading, Hollis Repair, Accounts. She thought she knew what that meant. Her bookkeeper's hands opened to the first page, expecting columns. What she found were names. Every page was names, each entry, a name, a date, what had been brought in, and a short note. March 3, 1994. The Kimura family's washing machine, drum bearing gone 3 hours. They brought cornbread, did not ask for money. March 19, 1994. An old man who walked from the trailer park on Route 9 with a broken box fan in a grocery bag. Fixed the capacitor. He cried when it came on. I don't know why I'm writing that down, but it seemed like the kind of thing that shouldn't be forgotten. Nadine sank down onto a bucket and kept reading. Some entries were short. August 12, 2001. The Mendez kid's bicycle, wheel and chain, no charge. Some were longer, written in the way of a man who had no one to tell things to and so told them to the page. October 2007. A woman came in with her mother's sewing machine. The mother died in August. The machine hadn't worked in 10 years, but the woman wanted it working again because the sound of it was the thing she remembered most. Spent 2 days on it. When she heard it run, she covered her face. Some things cannot be fixed. Some things can. The machine ran. That is enough. She read entries from before she'd known him. A young man's handwriting, rounder, less certain. She read through the years when they'd burned scavenged wood because the heating bill was more than the shop brought in. She'd been furious about those winters. She'd laid out the household accounts at the kitchen table and shown Warren exactly where they stood. Column by column, the shortfall written in red. He'd looked at the columns with genuine attention, and then he'd told her about the family on the east side whose furnace had quit in November. She'd had no answer for that, only anger, and the anger had nowhere to land, because it was not an argument she could win. She understood now, reading, that she had never been arguing about money. She had been arguing about what a life was for, and Warren had already settled that question quietly, some time before she'd ever met him, and had never found the words to explain it to her. She found a note in the margin of the 2004 notebook, in the corner of a page that recorded a Tuesday's work. Nadine stayed up past midnight, again doing the Ramirez books to cover what the shop didn't bring in. She thinks I don't notice. I notice everything. I just don't know how to thank a person for the way she holds the whole thing together without being asked. Nadine set the book down and breathed before she could pick it up again. She had spent 31 years believing he was oblivious. She had been wrong about that too. There were letters between the notebooks, folded into envelopes, some handwritten, some printed from email accounts. Thank you, Warren. My daughter is in college now, studying engineering. You fixed her first science fair project when the motor burned out, and you didn't charge us a cent, and you never made us feel small for not being able to pay. There was a letter from a man in Cincinnati who'd grown up in Hendricks Hollow, who wrote that when he was 12, his family's refrigerator had died in August, and Warren Hollis had fixed it in one afternoon, and left it on their porch while the family was at church, so no one would have to ask for help out loud. He wrote that he'd been a repairman himself for 20 years because of that afternoon. She read them all. The light moved across the floor and she did not stand up. Kit sat in the outer room, not interrupting, not leaving, only present in the way that turned out to be exactly what she needed. She understood, by the time the light went low, something she had not understood that morning. Warren Hollis had not wasted 31 years. He had spent them, deliberately, carefully, on people who had nothing else to spend it on. He had turned himself into the kind of place you could bring your broken things and know they'd be treated as though they mattered. She had called that foolish for 31 years. She had been wrong for 31 years. The man came to the shop on a Thursday in April in a black SUV that looked wrong in Hendricks Hollow, the way a silk tie looks wrong at a county fair. His name was Preston Langley. He was perhaps 40, smooth in the manner of someone who has learned that warmth is a tool and has used it long enough that he's forgotten the difference. He offered his condolences for Warren. He said he'd heard she'd inherited the property and wanted to help her make the best of a difficult situation. His company was developing the East Corridor. They'd bought 4 parcels in 18 months. The Hollis Repair Building sat at a key intersection. They'd had their eye on it for 2 years. He laid a number on the workbench. $38,000 for a building the county had appraised at 0. Nadine stood still. $38,000. She thought about the $211 in her account. She thought about her hands going stiff each morning. She thought about an old age with no pension, no savings, no children, and a cinder block building the county wanted to demolish anyway. Preston Langley had done this before. She could see it in the careful timing of his pause, in the way his eyes moved once to the frayed collar of her coat, taking the measure of her need and finding it useful. And then he said the thing that closed something in her chest. He looked around the shop, at the pegboard, at Kit on the stool, at the notebook she'd stacked on the counter, and said that it was a shame, really, what happened to places like this. Old repair shops were a thing of the past. Nobody fixed things anymore. His development would bring a modern service center, efficient, clean, much better for the whole area. Things like this, he said, gesturing at the room. They run their course. Nadine thought about what it had cost Warren to hold this room together for 30 years. She thought about the Cincinnati man's letter. She thought about the boy's bicycle still waiting on the bench, the last job Warren never finished. She thanked Preston Langley for his time. She said she needed a few days. He nodded in the generous way of a man who believes the outcome is already settled, left his card on the workbench beside the strip of masking tape, and drove away. That night she sat at the kitchen table with his business card and the number 38,000, and she let herself weigh it honestly. She had been poor most of her adult life, and she owed that fact a serious hearing. She thought about the warm house, the safe winter, the kind of breathing room she had never once had. There was a voice in her that had been tired of being noble for 31 years, and she let it speak. But then she thought about the next family whose refrigerator would die in August. She thought about where they would bring it. A development service center fixes things for people who can pay. Warren's shop had always been for everyone else. She drove to the county courthouse the next morning and asked to see the property records on 14 Cinder Street. The clerk pulled the file, and stapled to the back of the 2013 tax assessment was a document Nadine had never seen. A deed restriction notarized recorded April 7, 2011. The heading read, Community Service Designation, Hendricks Hollow Historic Register. She took it to Ed Farrow, the old attorney whose office above the pharmacy smelled of pipe tobacco long since given up. He put on his glasses and read the document slowly. Then he set it down and looked at her over the rims. Warren came to see me in 2011, he said. Sat right where you're sitting. He'd heard a developer had been buying up land on the east side and he'd started to think ahead. Ed Farrow paused, he said, and I wrote it down because it was the kind of thing worth keeping. he said. "The building doesn't matter to me. The use of it does. And I know what happens when a poor town gets a little bit valuable. The things that serve the people who had nothing are always the first things they clear away." Nadine did not speak. He asked me what he could do to protect the shop's purpose after he was gone. Not its structure, its use. I told him about the community designation process through the State Historic Register. It took 2 years of paperwork to get it recorded properly. Ed Farrow took off his glasses. Under the terms of that designation, 14 Cinder Street is legally protected as a community service property in perpetuity. It cannot be demolished for commercial development. It cannot be converted. Any subsequent owner must maintain its function as a community repair or service space. It is irrevocable. It was recorded with the state 14 years ago. He looked at her across the desk. I asked him once why he didn't just trust you with it. Trust that you'd keep it going, or fight for it if someone came. He let that sit for a moment. He said, "Nadine is the strongest person I know, but I'm not going to put that fight on her shoulders alone. If it's just her standing between the landing and a company with lawyers and money, one day they'll wear her down. I want the law to carry it. I want it protected even after there's nobody left strong enough to protect it." Nadine sat in that old chair and felt something shift in her chest in a way that had no word for it. For 31 years she had believed he hadn't thought about her future. It turned out he had spent 2 years quietly building her a wall. She hadn't known she was standing behind. We need to stop here for just a moment, because what comes next is something worth waiting for. If this story has found something in you, please subscribe to Giant Stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it helps this story reach the people who need it most. Now let's go back to Nadine, and to Preston Langley, who was about to learn the thing his whole career had never taught him. Preston Langley returned in May with 2 people in suits that did not belong in Hendricks Hollow. He spread plans across the workbench, renderings and projections, the full machinery of a man certain of his outcome. He'd been informed about the designation, he said, but these things were often workable. His company had partnered with historic preservation boards before. There was always a process. Nadine did not argue. She laid the notarized designation certificate on top of his plans, face up. One of the suited men picked it up. He read it, then read it again. He leaned over and said something quietly, and Nadine watched the confidence leave Preston Langley's face the way water drains out of wet sand. Slowly, then all at once. He tried. Of course he tried. He talked about appeals, about amendments, about the economic good of the community. His own attorney shook his head very slightly, the shake of a man paid to know when a fight is already lost before it starts. The designation was permanent, recorded with the state 14 years prior. There was no workable process. This building could never become what he had planned for it. Preston Langley stood up. He looked around the shop one last time. At the notebooks on the counter, at Kit on the stool, at the masking tape tacked back to the edge of the bench, and Nadine watched him try to find the number that would make it make sense. He could not find one because the thing he was looking at had no number. It had only people's names written in a dead man's hand across 40 years of composition notebooks. Before he left, he asked her why. He said it almost sincerely. Why a woman in her position would refuse that kind of money for a building the county had assessed at $0. Nadine looked at him for a moment, not to win the argument, only because it seemed like someone ought to tell him the truth at least once. "My husband didn't own this shop," she said. "He held it, for the people who needed it, and he made sure, 14 years ago, that when he was gone, no number you could write on a check would ever be bigger than what he'd already given away. You appraised it at $0. He appraised it at everything he had. One of you measured wrong." Preston Langley left and did not come back. The people of Hendricks Hollow came in the weeks that followed the way they come in small towns, one at a time, unannounced, standing in the doorway with their hats in their hands. A woman in her 60s who'd had her washing machine fixed free of charge every year for a decade while she raised 3 kids alone. A man who'd worked beside Warren one morning, clearing a fallen tree from a neighbor's driveway without being asked, who'd never told anyone, and didn't know how to say thank you until now. A young woman who'd grown up in the trailer park on Route 9 and said Warren had fixed her mother's space heater 3 winters running. And once, when her mother was too sick to come herself, had loaded the heater in his truck, driven it out, installed it, and left before the family came home. They told their stories standing in the shop because that felt right. And Nadine listened in a way she had not listened in 31 years, because the anger that had lived in her chest for so long had finally found its way out through the cinder block floor of a building on Cinder Street, and what it left behind was a quiet she could actually hear in. She understood, listening to them, that the work Warren had been doing was not different from what she had done. He repaired the things people couldn't replace. She kept the numbers so those same people wouldn't have to face the worst alone. They had been doing the same work in different languages for 31 years, and had never found the words to say so to each other. Kit stayed. She asked him if he wanted to, and he answered by arriving the next morning before she got there, sweeping the floor and turning on the work light the way Warren must have taught him. She applied for a small business grant through the county's Historic Preservation Fund. A fund, Ed Farrow told her, that had almost never been used because almost no building in Hendricks Hollow had ever held that designation. The structural repairs were made that summer. People came to help, some of them names from the notebooks, some of them the children of names, some of them neighbors, who'd never spoken more than 2 words to Warren and felt, now that he was gone, a debt they hadn't known they were running. Nadine learned to fix things, not with Warren's instinct, not yet, maybe not ever, but with the patience of a woman who had spent decades reconstructing other people's finances from incomplete information. She found that a broken machine has its own logic, a chain of causes and effects, and that if you slowed down enough to read it, it told you what it needed. She found, working beside Kit in the quiet of the shop through that autumn, that the two of them had developed a language between them the way all real languages develop, out of necessity and proximity, and a willingness to stop waiting for the other person to speak first. She found the last blank notebook in the very bottom of the filing cabinet, still in its dollar store plastic wrap. She sat at the workbench on a September evening, the work light on, the town quiet outside. Kit had gone home. The shop smelled of oil and sawdust, and something she could only identify now as the warmth of a room that has held a lot of people's trust. She opened the notebook to the first page. She thought about Warren. Not the Warren she'd argued with for 31 years. Not the man she'd built in her mind out of resentment and worry, but the actual man. The one who had written her name in the margins of notebooks and never known how to say out loud what he meant by it. She thought about what she would tell him if he were still here, sitting across this bench with those quiet hands. She didn't think she'd apologize. He would have taken the apology apart and handed it back piece by piece, pointing out that she'd held their whole life together while he was out giving it away, and that anyone who thought that wasn't love had never held a household on not enough money for 30 years. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the name of the first person who'd brought something in that week, an elderly man from the east side whose electric kettle had stopped working. She wrote what was wrong with it, how long the fix had taken, and the reason she hadn't charged him. Then she added one more line at the bottom of the entry, the way you'd write a note in a margin, for no reason, except that some things shouldn't be forgotten. Worth keeping is worth fixing. Every name in this book already knew that. I'm just learning it now. She closed the notebook. Outside, through the front window, the street light on Cinder Street had come on, throwing a pale circle of yellow onto the cracked sidewalk, onto the hand-painted sign too faded to read unless you already knew what it said. She turned off the work light and left the window lamp burning, the way Warren always had, so that anyone walking by in the dark would know there was still someone inside who gave damn about the things they couldn't afford to lose.